My name is James, and what is the Great Leap Forward? The Great Leap Forward is one of the greatest tragedies that the world has ever seen. The event resulted in the deaths of 15 to 50 million people. This was a result of a relatively new China under the CCP, which was looking to industrialize alongside the rest of the world and their communist counterparts. The mass movement of labor from agriculture into steel resulted in a massive shortage of agricultural production and thus mass famine. But why? How could something like this happen in a country that was meant to be the greatest communist utopia the world had ever seen? And the real question on everybody's mind is, whose fault was it? To understand how all this happened, first we must understand who Mao Zedong is and his role in the creation of the People's Republic of China. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, to a poor family that gained wealth through farming. He was raised in a village and was put to work on the family farm at only 13 years old, but shortly decided it was time to move out and pursue his education. When I was 13, all I cared about was the next Xbox game that was going to come out. Only a few years had passed, and at only the age of 20, he was witnessing a revolution in his own country. He decided he would join the revolutionary forces and went to fight. This only lasted 4 months and resulted in the establishment of the Republic of China. So at only 20 years old, Mao had experienced and was part of the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. At 20, I hardly knew what dynasty even meant. Mao went on to work a variety of jobs and continued his education at Peking University in Beijing, where he worked as an assistant librarian. This is where he met revolutionary communists. The May 4th movement was one of the first political movements he was a part of, beside war. It was a cultural and anti-imperialist protest led by students, but mainly in protest of the Treaty of Versailles, which gave land to Japan. He was around 26 at the time, and it inspired him to write this. The world is ours, the nation is ours, society is ours. If we do not speak, who will speak? If we do not act, who will act? And this was the start of his political activism. He joined the Communist Party, and as a teacher at the primary school, he organized a branch of the Socialist Youth League. It wasn't until he witnessed a protest in his hometown that he realized the revolutionary potential of the peasantry. He thought, you know what? These poor people aren't so bad. His changed perception on peasants and his new commitment to Marxism cultivated a new perspective in which the peasantry would be the source of China's regeneration. At around 1927, the communists thought, you know what? We don't really like the way the nationalists are running things. I think we should be the ones running things. And thus began the Chinese Communist Revolution. The initial attempted revolution in 1926 proved to be a huge failure that nearly killed all of the communists in China. This resulted in Mao re-strategizing and eventually gaining the upper hand for the communists, and thus really beginning the Chinese Communist Revolution. During this time, he encircled and trapped cities with weak military, but was unable to defeat the nationalists' elite fighters. It wasn't until the Japanese joined the fight that the two decided to create a coalition to fight against the Japanese. Through the united front against the Japanese, the communists increased their numbers by about 1 million. In 1943, Mao established himself as the supreme leader of the party. That's a pretty nice title, isn't it? Mao built his prestige through his political and war tactics and established himself leader in the notable decision in 1943, which gave him authority to personally decide critical matters. Mao was a pragmatist and would recognize the lack of knowledge he had. He even allowed leaders of other parties to take control of areas where he lacked expertise. And in 1949, with the backing of the Soviet Union, the CCP was officially in control. Yay, the communist utopia is near us, and the bourgeoisie has been destroyed. Let's go, let's go. There's one important thing to think about as we talk about the Great Leap Forward. As I said before, Mao had established himself as the leader of the CCP, the supreme leader of the CCP. But this isn't in the same way we might think about in the US or other Western countries. As opposed to there being a structure of government in which the leader has to function around, the structure of government was created around the leader in the Communist Chinese Party. He didn't ask for permission for the things that he wanted. He simply said it and it got done. This is completely different than the political influence the president tries to place on other branches of government. Mao was the leader of all aspects of the government. No matter where you looked, he was at the head. This meant that what he says goes. While this seems scary, Mao was quite pragmatic and understood where he lacked knowledge. As a result, he placed himself mainly in what was known as the second front, meaning he dealt with more of the ideology of the party and allowed the members of the first front to create and execute policy of said theory. This was actually going well in the beginning and allowed China to prosper as a new nation. The country was industrializing and the agricultural output was stable, but couldn't keep up with the growing population or with the rest of the world. Most of the models they followed were based on their Soviet counterparts, who seemed to know what they were doing. They didn't know what they were doing. Mao didn't like this very much because he believed that China was superior to the Soviets, so having to take after the Soviet model was a blow to his ego. But there was one big glaring difference between the two countries, being that the Soviets already had an established industrial sector, as opposed to China building theirs from the ground up. Now let's talk about the theory. Explaining Marxism and Leninism would take a whole other video, but I'll put it simply. Marxism is a theory of history, and Leninism is a political theory, meaning it explains what to do once the communists are in power. Leninism is based on Marxism, which explains everything through class struggle. The main class struggle that the Marxist-Leninists fight against is that of the bourgeoisie, the business owner class, and the proletariat, the employed class. Both Marx and Lenin view the proletariat as incapable and unintelligent, therefore incapable of creating the revolution necessary for a communist utopia. But don't worry, Lenin solved this problem with the vanguard. Yay, the political elite! The vanguard would be made up of educated communists that would lead the proletariat into revolution, with the intellectual elites leading from behind. The biggest difference from Mao and the Marxist-Leninists is his view of the proletariat. He believed that the proletariat would be the ones that would guide the vanguard. This meant that the vanguard would have to listen to the proletariat in order to lead the masses. This guiding principle was known as the mass line. In other words, they'd go from the masses to the masses. Another substantial difference was the idea of voluntarism. Voluntarism is the belief that human will can be decisive in bringing about major historical changes. This is one of the main points separating Maoist thought from orthodox Marxism. Essentially, if there was enough people that wanted to achieve a certain goal, then it would get done. Now, let's talk about the Great Leap Forward. We already established that China's industrialization was lacking compared to the rest of the world. Mao was the head of essentially everything, and at this point, his iron fist was leading him. This was mainly due to the large failure of the 100 Flowers movement, which opened the regime to criticism, but Mao couldn't handle it when they started critiquing him, and the whole movement backfired. Mao now placed himself in the first front, and decided to make the economic policy positions, even though he acknowledged that he knew little about economics. Mao had large, unrealistic goals to try to make economic progress the world had never seen. And this took place in the form of increased creation of steel and decrease of agriculture. Many of the lands used to make the steel didn't have the infrastructure for steel creation. This created an inefficient industrialization process and greatly reduced agricultural production. This meant that the roughly 650 million population was going to starve. Being that the government controlled everything, they decided who got the food, and they believed that the major cities were the only ones with political power to threaten the regime. This meant that the villages saw the worst of the famine, even though the villagers were the ones making most of the agricultural production. How much Mao actually knew about this is up for debate. And this is because the culture within the government was one that walked around eggshells when it came to reporting to Mao. Many of the leaders in the villages didn't want to be punished for the lacking grain production, so they reported higher output than was actually being made. Many actually viewed Mao as sympathetic to the starvation, and he even held a conference to hear out any potential reforms. But the prospect of reform was shattered when the Minister of Defense, forgive me because I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation, Peng Dehuai, wrote a harsh letter of criticism to Mao and made him feel like he was being challenged. Mao began giving harsher punishment to dissenters, which created an environment of secrecy within the regime about the famine numbers in order to not be perceived as rightists. It wasn't until the late 1960s that Mao recognized the overreaching of the Great Leap and decided to take a backseat, essentially leaving his subordinates to clean up the mess. That mess being the death of millions. Thanks for sticking around to the end. I know it's kind of a depressing topic, but I actually found it really interesting, and I hope you did as well. Let me know down in the comments what you thought. Let me know if you thought I got some things wrong. Let me know if you hate communists. Let me know about other topics you might be interested in that I could look into. Another one that I will be doing is another communist failure called the Holodomor. But other than that, leave a comment, like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. And have an amazing day.